bustling, growing community like Concordia, Saturday night needs entertainment, and that means going to see a movie at the Mohican. This week, Citizen Kane with Orson Welles. So step inside this 1930s era Art Deco movie theater. I started the design process by looking at examples of 1930s and 1940s era Art Deco theaters, and this one in Avenel, California, seemed to offer both interest and simplicity. So I began working with a feature with a known size, which was a door, and having resized the image to N-scale dimensions, I was happy to see that my guess that the door would be 7 feet tall was correct. I was surprised, though, it was only 32 inches wide. This theater had to undergo renovations after a fire and was made ADA compliant, and I thought a door had to be 36 inches wide to accommodate wheelchairs to be compliant. But it turns out 32 inches is the minimum, and particularly when you have a double door like this, which gives the full opening a 5-foot wide berth. I made a rectangle around one of the doors, duplicated it, and then with snapping applied, slid the second door to the right. I then duplicated both of those doors and slid them to the right to cover the other opening. After accidentally altering the colors of the doors, I completed the wall by drawing a box in between the two sets of doors, and then recolored the second set of doors brown and orange just to differentiate them. I finished off the space by adding a yellow rectangle to the wall over the doors, and now I have the complete width of the rear of the lobby. I then selected all of the objects and dragged them to an open area of the canvas. From there, it wasn't very difficult to build the rest of the lobby to the theater. I've mentioned over the past couple of videos my admiration for Metcalfe models and their well thought out designs and the way they neatly go together. I wanted to see if I could design something similar for my layout. I figured the theater lobby would be where I could test it out, so I found the directions for one of the Metcalfe models, its low relief shopfront, online that had similar features to what I was building and thought I could use that as a template. One of the neat features of Inkscape is being able to import and edit PDF files into the program. So I imported the Metcalfe instructions into Inkscape, and then using the ungroup feature, I was able to just pull out the pictures from the instructions, and then I was able to get rid of the instructions since I really didn't need them. All I was looking at was just the pictures, just so I could get a design idea for the build. As you can see, the floor, or what Metcalfe calls the base section, is somewhat similar to the theater lobby with the notch in the floor for the angled walls. But that's what I meant about the well thought out design of Metcalfe models. In just one piece of card, you were getting floor, ceiling, sidewalls, and storefront, and almost all of them were double card thick because of the ingenious way they folded the card back in on itself. So I started the design by copying the full width of the lobby floor and outer front walls, then duplicated it just as was done in the instructions. As you can see though, the lower notch section is narrower than the base section, and that's because it's reduced by the thickness of the sidewall card that will be folded in on itself and be glued to the floor. My 0.5 millimeter card is actually 0.559 millimeters thick, so doubling that, I get 1.118 millimeters thick wall that needs to be cut out of the lower part of the lobby floor. To achieve that, I made a rectangle out of pink, and I sized it to be 1.118 millimeters. Then I duplicated it, brought it across to the other side, and then using the path difference function, I would cut it out from each side of the lower rectangle. All that was left to do was cut the lobby notch out of the floor, just to do path difference yet again, and cut the notch out of the floor. As you can see in the Metcalfe design, the front face of the shop window, it's got a bend in it, and that bend matches the side wall of the notch in the lower floor. To determine the length of my front wall, I need to use the measuring tool to measure the front face of the theater wall and then measure this angled piece to see how long that one was. And that would give me the full length of the side wall there if I was just to have the card fold in on itself. Using a second rectangle, I was able to make the correct width on the wall that would be folding in. And then I drew a line down and made it a dotted line, just so that I would have a point of reference as to where the card would fold. I then duplicated the rectangle, flipped it end for end, and then slid it into place on the other side so I'd have a mirror image. To make the side wing walls, it was basically the same process. I just made a rectangle that was actually double the side width, since it was going to be folded in on itself to give extra rigidity. And then made a second box to divide the rectangle in half, and then drew a dotted line down to again provide reference for the fold. I duplicated the box and then put it into position on the other side. The last thing that was needed is just to make the roof, and that's a mirror image of the bottom. So I ended up just copying each of the individual pieces, flipping them end for end, and putting them into place. For fun, I just duplicated the colors because this is going to have a wrap that's going to go over this shape. I figured, as I said, for fun, I would copy the colors of the Metcalfe model. To make the marquee overhead, I started by copying the size of the rectangle of the lobby, since it's going to sit on top of the lobby. I then drew a second rectangle, the same width as the original, but extended it out the length of the overhang that I wanted it to have. I wanted it to overhang the sidewalk, and that's about a scale 10 feet. Because I wanted it to come to a point, I drew another rectangle on top of the second one, and then using the line tool, I made a triangle so that it would come to that point that I was looking for. I could then delete the other rectangles and be left with the marquee overhang. As you can see in this picture here, though, the front of the overhang isn't a sharp point, but rather is rounded. To achieve that effect, I converted the triangle to a path, and then using the Path Effects tool, I used rounded corners, and then pulling down on that node right there, pulling up on the node, it'll round the corner. I then duplicated it to make the top section, and then had to figure out how I was going to calculate the length of the sign. Had it just been triangular in shape with the point, that wouldn't have been a problem. I could just measure all the angles. But because it's rounded, you have to measure around the curve. To do this, I duplicated the triangle, colored it white, and then gave it a black outline. I then selected the nodes tool and highlighted the two baseline nodes. And then using the break nodes apart tool, I then went up to the paths menu and selected break apart. Using the selector tool, you click on the baseline and then click delete. And now you're just left with the length of the curved part of the marquee. To measure the curved line, you go up to extensions, choose visualize path, and then measure path, and that gives you the measurement of your curved line. In our case, that's 97.171 millimeters, but we still need to take the height of that gray rectangle and then double that, because the sign is actually going to run that entire length from the side of the gray rectangle up along the outside of the green triangle and then down the other side. All that's left to do is to make the pediment that rises up behind the theater and gives the theater its Art Deco feel. The pediment is essentially a series of rectangles and circles that are fused together by using the union tool under the paths menu. Or Alternatively, cutting out circles from the designs. Here I've got the center portion of the arch design, and I've made a circle that's the same width as the rectangle, and using the snapping function I set the circle on top of the rectangle, and then doing path union I fuse them together. As you can see, there's an outline around this center arch, and to recreate that, what I did was use the Path Effects tool from the Paths menu. You select the item you want to have an offset on, select how big of an offset that you want. For me, that was 1 millimeter. Hit enter, and then send it to the back. I want to get rid of that little green line that goes across the bottom. So if I just use the up arrow on it when I select it, it'll actually distort the arch at the top. So I make a rectangle, do path difference, and delete the little section at the bottom. Here I'm making the arch shape that goes behind this original one, and I do the exact same thing as I did before, but I use a 3 millimeter offset. And I'm just cutting out that little bottom section again and deleting it, do path difference. To make the border around that one, I duplicate the arch, make a different color, and then use the Path Effects menu again. I use 1 millimeter. It makes the offset a little bit wider, and I send it to the back. And then I just need to delete that line at the bottom again by using path difference with this rectangle. As you can see in this picture though, this arch has a little wing to it. So what I do to do that is I make a rectangle the entire length of the arch, and then I'm going to cut out that little bit of a circle at the top of it. I duplicate the circle, and then using path difference, I take a slice out of that top rectangle, and then I do the same thing with the bottom rectangle. I slide the second circle over, position it so that there's a slight reveal, and then take a slice out of it, doing path difference. I duplicate the wing and then place that on the other side. And then using path union, I merge the two wings with the arch. And it's going to be the exact same process for this second lower wing. And I'll fast forward through this as you watch me make the rectangles, duplicate them, use the circles to cut out the shape, and then merge it with the other wing through path union. The theater itself is just a square or rectangle, and so I just made a series of rectangles, made them to the correct dimensions, put them into the proper space, and then prepared to print all the different parts on a printer. I put together a paper mock-up to test for size and whether the concept was sound, which it all seemed to be. As you can see from this view of the lobby, the Metcalf model style design really seemed to come together nicely, so I decided to print out a card version. The card model was printed onto the back of an old soda box, and it confirmed the size was right. For the lobby though, I wasn't sure how best to proceed. This version is the textures printed onto paper and then glued to the soda box card, and while it offered sturdiness, the paper would tear at the folds even when pre-creased, and the fit just looked poor. I subsequently tried it on 0.5 millimeter cardstock and got similar or worse results. What I ultimately decided to use was 100 GSM stock, which is pretty much a cross between paper and card, and the resulting model seemed to offer both rigidity and flexibility to fold without tearing. Unfortunately, I don't have footage of the standalone version because it was a deeply frustrating test of patience and trial and error putting it together using various techniques. But in the end, the final version is what made it onto the model. Same goes for the ticket taker's box, which is just a bit of card cut into an octagon shape and backed with cake box acetate. For the rest of the theater, I used 1mm card and put it through my Cricut because it can provide a more precise cut than I can. As you can see though, it didn't cut all the way through, and that's primarily because I didn't want it to. I allowed it to cut almost all the way through, and then I finished it up using a scalpel. Then it was mounted to 2 layers of cardstock, to which a sidewalk texture was applied. The last detail was to affix the letters of the theater name, the Mohican, which for a New England Northeast region themed railroad seemed fitting. I found these 2mm high letters on eBay that are actually for necklaces or bracelets, but I like their industrial look, particularly with the hole running through the middle. Then, using the super glue gel I got from the dollar store, I glued each of the letters into place on the marquee, starting with the letter I in the middle, and then going to the letter M, and then N, and back to O, and so forth, to ensure that each of the letters was evenly spaced across the top of the marquee. My meat hooks or fingers often got in the way, but we got there in the end. And this was the completed theater and marquee. I think it came out pretty well. A little fiddly, as I said, particularly for my big hands, but I think it looks good, and it fits nice, has good proportion on the layout. The pediment was made out of built up layers of card to which texture was applied, including the back, which has a sheet of yellow paper attached to it, and then the edges of the card were colored in yellow as well. These wires, they're actually for lighting. There's one single LED lamp underneath the marquee to shine down. That's actually an image of the underneath lights of a marquee that I glued into place underneath it. Then I drilled a hole for the LED light bulb and glued it into place. I was also going to light up the ticket taker's booth, but I decided not to. I think there'll be plenty of light coming from that bulb there to shine into the booth. So you can come see Citizen Kane at the Mohican Theater in Concordia. Okay, thanks for watching.